Consider Cannabis is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment recommendations. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition.
The state of Ohio does not have any reciprocity with other medical cannabis states, and one of the difficulties they're running into right now is the sharing of patient data. Obviously, privacy concerns and stuff like that, so they're working through some of those issues, but that's on the horizon too.
It's time to consider cannabis. I'm your host, Curtis. This is the 20th episode of Consider Cannabis. Last week we spoke to Nico Misla, and if you missed it, you should go back and give it a listen. But not just now, because in a few moments we're going to sit down with Brian Higgins. Now, Brian is an attorney at Frost Brown Todd in Cincinnati, Ohio. He's a corporate lawyer with specialized knowledge of the healthcare industry's nuanced statutes and regulations. And in his career, he's done some pretty cool things. He's advised pharmaceutical manufacturers on Medicare's 340B program. He's drafted corporate formation documents, including operation agreements, bylaws, and codes of regulations for healthcare entities. He's assisted in negotiating the multi-million-dollar sale of Physicians Group to a national healthcare system. He's advised clients on the federal Stark Law and counseled clients on privacy issues like HIPAA. And if that's all not exciting enough for you, he's also created and implemented organization-wide approaches to various healthcare facilities' approach to medical marijuana. Now, Brian brings a perspective to the conversation that is as unique as the challenges presented by medical cannabis laws themselves, as he's assisted healthcare providers and entrepreneurs with understanding the federal law and how it interacts with our local medical cannabis laws. We'll talk to Brian about medical cannabis, patients' rights, hospital visits, transportation of product, the best way to implement a medical cannabis treatment plan for our aging relatives who are living in nursing facilities, the Rohrabacher Amendment, which protects healthcare facilities from federal prosecution in states that have a medical cannabis program, and we'll touch on the First Step Act, which eliminated mandatory minimum sentencing for nonviolent drug offenders and reduced the sentences of nearly 2,600 federal prisoners. We're going to talk about all this and more, so join me and we'll sit down with Brian Higgins of Frost Brown and Todd, discuss cannabis law, and we'll consider cannabis together. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why don't you start by telling us a little about your first experience with cannabis and how that progressed into you becoming this cannabis law guru in Ohio?
Sure. So first experience with cannabis would probably be in college. But beyond that, I sort of knew that I had to put college Brian away and sort of learn what it was like to be an adult. And so throughout law school and then after eventually landing here at Frost Brown Todd, I sort of knew that my only opportunity to ever get back in sort of that industry, that business would be to, maybe advise clients and entrepreneurs on, how they might navigate an industry that is, fraught with questions and various regulations and risks, and how I might help them, sort of create a successful business model, and also help people who, definitely do say that cannabis has helped them. So that's sort of been my experience with it so far.
I hope you don't mind me pointing this out. You look considerably younger than me. How long have you been practicing law?
So I've been practicing law since 2016.
2016. And
right.
How long since?
So the law passed in Ohio in June of 2016, and I had been here for just a few months at the time. And so, as sort of a new person at a big organization, you're trying to make a name for yourself, figure out, where do I fit in with everything? I was already on the healthcare team. It was medical marijuana. And so it just sort of felt like a natural fit to say, hey, we need someone to learn this stuff. I might as well do it. Here's my opportunity. It was something that I was definitely interested in. I've always been sort of someone who wants to forecast out what a new issue is going to be or what a new industry is going to be. I don't have the risk appetite to be an entrepreneur, but I do have the interest to maybe help the person who does have that sort of appetite. So
yeah, that's definitely a personality type.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think lawyers in general are pretty risk averse. Like, we have no problem telling someone like, you probably shouldn't do that. But at the same time, it's not something that I would engage in myself. Or tell people like, hey, go for it. You can, do these things, and there's there's a pretty good chance nothing bad will happen, but I would probably myself never engage in those activities. So I think it's just the sort of in the makeup of becoming a lawyer.
Okay. So how involved are you in the formation of cannabis law?
So as far as formation of law goes, I have a colleague in our West Virginia office who has sort of been instrumental with helping the state there, sort of understand some of the nuances and maybe have that state look at, the blueprint that other states have laid out, because medical marijuana laws have been around since California passed its law in 1996. So there's really an opportunity for lawyers who are in states that don't have a law yet to get involved with their legislators and sort of figure out, hey, this is what's worked in other states. This is how, we can help you implement the same thing here. As far as my involvement goes, I haven't been involved at the legislature level or anything like that. I've just sort of been involved with having people who were excited here in Ohio who said, here's an opportunity. This law is passed. There are only X amount of licenses available to become a cultivator, a dispensary. We need someone who can help us on the applications. We need someone who can help us interpret the regulations and make sure we're answering questions right, maybe putting forth answers that, we think that the state is going to like and eventually award us a license. That was sort of my involvement and continues to be my involvement, at least on the commercial side.
So hospitals, I'm seeing on Facebook a lot of people concerned about hospital visits and how hospitals are not allowing patients to have their medical cannabis with them. What kind of rights do patients really have when they're in a hospital situation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's not only, in a hospital setting, it's the same thing in a senior living facility or a hospice or palliative care setting, but with respect to a patient's rights in those instances, at least in a state like Ohio and actually a lot of other states that have a medical marijuana or cannabis law, those patients, they really don't have many rights, because oftentimes the state has said, hospital or whatever public place we're talking about, those places are allowed to decide whether they want to permit utilization on their premises or not. And so unless a patient is at a place that has said, yes, we see the value in this for our patients, you're allowed to have it, those patients unfortunately really don't have much recourse. The only thing they really can do is try to decide in advance, hey, I'm going to go to this hospital because they've said that I'm allowed to have my medical cannabis while I'm actually receiving treatment. And some have said that. Healthcare is sort of an interesting thing, though, too, because the more and more that I'm involved in the healthcare industry, whether it's as a lawyer or a patient, I've really started to understand that it's a difficult industry to navigate. I feel like patient education is super low in this country. People don't understand, even what a deductible is or what their insurance is or how to go to a provider who is within network and how that will, decrease their costs. But that's just something that there's a major gap there. So, a patient who might decide, hey, I'm going to go to this doctor or this healthcare setting because they allow medical marijuana, maybe that might not be the best thing for them because that provider might be out of network on their insurance and their bill's going to be much higher had they chosen to go somewhere else, for example. So
right.
It's just sort of it's definitely a factor in, I think, a patient's consideration where they get health care. But I think they just need to be aware of a lot of
I don't have a lot of hospital visit experience, but the ones I do have, I felt held hostage. I couldn't leave until I got discharged and okay by the doctor. So it does really seem like making that plan in advance of what hospital you want to go to, it seems really important. Is that true in your legal viewpoint?
It's true in my legal viewpoint. It's true as a consumer. Anytime you just want to make sure that the majority of your visit, your treatment's going to be paid for through your insurance if you're fortunate enough to have insurance, and especially if you're going to be utilizing something like cannabis while you're in an inpatient setting there, you want to be able to make sure that you're going to be able to continue those treatments.
Do you know how that works? I'm a medical cannabis patient. I go to the hospital. They don't want me to have medical cannabis in the hospital, but they don't want to give me opiates because I'm on medical cannabis. Like, what happens then? Do I just not get any pain medicine?
So what likely would happen is they would say, our general policy here is that you can't have this on our property. And, that's mainly due to the federal laws, which we should talk about as well.
Sure,
about Medicare
absolutely.
and Medicaid.
Yeah.
And they will, and in that instance, if you as the patient, because a lot of patients are like this, they say, hey, I don't want to have, I also don't want opiates. So the reason I take medical cannabis is because I
don't want those.
Don't want those. Obviously super taboo in our society right now. And so a lot of people are saying, I just don't want treatment with that. So in that instance, if you as the patient do decide, well, then I don't want to stay here anymore, what the health system or what the hospital will likely do is discharge you, and they'll probably give you a form that discharges you against medical advice. So like they'll say, hey, you can still get your treatment here. We're happy to help you with the recovery after your surgery or whatever you're here for. If you want to leave based on the fact that we don't allow you to have cannabis on our premises, that's going to be against medical advice. We want you to sign this form. Because then if anything happens to you outside of that setting, they don't want to be held liable. And because they're really saying, hey, we can still treat you. We have the ability to treat you. It's not against the law for us to say, hey, we prohibit cannabis here. So that's what's likely going to happen. Now, whether or not you want to sign that form is up to you.
Right.
But obviously, as unsophisticated healthcare consumers, anybody gets a form these days from a big, scary entity, and they're like, you got to sign this, you're probably going to sign it.
Yeah.
I mean, most likely no one's going to sit there and say, now me on the other hand, I might be like, okay, I'm going to sit here and read this thing, and I'm going to decide not to.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but it's just, but who does that? Who in their right mind actually does that? It just doesn't really happen. So.
I was going to say lawyers and jerks, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Like, oh, my God, you're a lawyer? You're actually going to, no one's ever
You're
read
really going to sit here and read this? Okay,
right.
great.
No one's
buddy.
read
All
this
right.
thing before, yeah. But, I mean, I don't know if you want to touch on sort of the reasoning behind a lot of the health systems and the reasons that they, because there are health systems out there who will probably say, if you got their board into a room, they might say, hey, I have seen my epileptic uncle who, does see success through cannabis, for example. Well, the health system as a whole, their big issue is that they get federal money. They get a lot of their patients and care is reimbursed through the Medicare program, for example. And one of the conditions to participating in the Medicare program and being able to receive money from the federal government is that you comply with federal law. It's really that you don't violate federal law. And so they think by allowing, or by even putting out a policy that allows medical cannabis to be on their premises or allow a patient to receive treatment with that's against federal law, because marijuana is designated as, whether recreational or medical or otherwise, any type of marijuana is designated as a Schedule I drug, and so it's illegal to even possess, for example. So a lot of hospitals are sort of, especially in the newer states, are, they're worried about whether or not, hey, will us saying that a patient can come in here and use their medical marijuana, is that considered a violation of federal law? Does that mean that we're going to lose our reimbursement from Medicare, which is, maybe 60 or 70% of the money we get in the door for treating patients? That's obviously a huge, huge risk to them, because if that was taken away, then this whole health system would likely crumble. They wouldn't have any more money in the door. But the reality of the situation is that we've never seen that actually happen. And again, having California with a law since 1996, no one's ever lost their enrollment because of that. But it's such a large, it's such an elephant in the room for these places. It's a lot of times nobody wants to be the one person on the board at that health system to say, no, we should allow it, because who wants to put their name on something that risky? But what has really, I think, sort of brought a lot of these healthcare institutions more on board is what's known as the Rohrabacher Amendment, something that I talked about in my presentation with you, which has been around since 2014, and it's a provision included in the federal government spending bill, and it's got to be renewed in September of 2019. But what it's been interpreted as by the federal courts is that for states that have a medical marijuana law, the federal government's not allowed to use any money to go after anybody in those states who strictly comply with their state's medical marijuana law. So in other words, health system, if you are doing everything that Ohio's medical marijuana law says and you're following the law to a T, the federal government's not allowed to use any funds to prosecute you theoretically to say that you're violating a condition of participation in Medicare, and we're going to take away your enrollment. So for those who have really taken the time to understand that and have, had conversations about it as a health system and have become comfortable with that protection, and they know that the horse has sort of left the barn on at least medical cannabis in this country. They've, come up with policies and procedures to allow inpatient utilization and make sure that those policies and procedures follow exactly what Ohio law says. So everybody within the organization can become comfortable with allowing patients to utilize on their property.
You touched on Medicaid there. What does medical cannabis look like for people who are living in Medicaid and Medicare? I mean, they are just as confused.
Right. First of all, it's called, at least in Ohio, it's called medical marijuana. So they think medical and they think, I'm a Medicare patient, or maybe I have Medicare Part D coverage. So I'm that typically covers a prescription drug. So they themselves are probably thinking, great, I'm going to be able to go to a dispensary and have my government insurance cover my edibles. And
right.
So unfortunately that's not the case, again, for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about, that the federal government doesn't recognize it as a viable treatment. So they'll say it's medically unnecessary. Marijuana to the federal government is illegal. So unfortunately for any patient who's covered by Medicare or Medicaid, for example, they're not going to be able to have the treatment reimbursed. So that's why a lot of patients, when they go to see a doctor who is able to recommend cannabis to them, they go in and oftentimes there's a flat fee. I think I've seen it varies on the physician you go to and maybe sort of the time and effort that they're putting into it, but I've seen prices from $150 to $350 just for your initial visit. And then if you eventually are recommended cannabis, then you go to the dispensary again. That's another out-of-pocket expense for you. It's not going to be covered by any type of insurance, at least as of right now. So yeah, it's still, and obviously a lot of people who are on Medicare or Medicaid are disabled, poor, and so it makes it sort of a difficult situation for them. And I guess tying into that, I did bring some prices here, some prices per ounce. In the different medical marijuana states, at least, around Ohio, for example. Okay. So right now, Ohio, the price per ounce for a patient is $480. You look at Michigan, it's $320. Pennsylvania, $480 as well. Illinois, $375. So we're talking about some super high prices here for people who are excited about the ability to get cannabis to treat themselves, and now are maybe walking into a dispensary and being like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Did not expect it would be that expensive. And obviously, those prices should go down as more and more dispensaries become operational and other.
Sure. We see what happens in Oregon. With
exactly. Yeah.
Their surplus of cannabis.
Yeah. Now they have too much, right?
Yeah.
So, those prices are inevitably going to come down, but you just hope that they come down to a level that eventually meet the needs of a patient who's able to pay for them.
Yeah, that's the most heartbreaking thing to me, is knowing that just what FECO can do for you, and the fact that people can't afford it and they literally have to die because they can't afford it and can't get it, and that's really heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is that really I don't think that's going to change until it changes on a federal level. Everything I ever hear from anybody talking about policy or why it is this way with the police or with the hospitals, it always comes back to federal.
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% right. And I think that this is my prediction. If the 2020 election does swing the House and the Senate to a Democratic majority, that also sort of assumes that the presidential race will also go to a Democrat. I do think, based on the fact that we are already 33 states with at least medical cannabis laws, that there is a high likelihood that maybe not at the beginning of that new president's term, but maybe at the end, that we could see some sort of federal change.
So you think it could be as far as 5 years out before we see a federal change?
I do. I don't think anybody's jumping on that. I think that I think the federal government, at least right now, is They're probably okay with the way that the states have served as like a laboratory for each of the medical cannabis laws. They're probably not as okay with the recreational usage, but they've sort of tolerated it at this point. So I don't see them making a big jump on it, but I do think that if there is a new, or if there's new representation with as progressive an agenda, I think that might get some of these folks elected. We could see federal legislation on the horizon, which is probably way different than anybody would have ever said to you, even 10 years ago, or especially, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So it's just sort of like these dominoes are slowly falling. But
so in your perspective, what do you think is really causing the delay on those dominoes?
It's sort of ironic, but I think it's a lack of data and science that's been at least consumed by a lot of people who represent us in the government. And that's obviously been slowed down, at least by the fact that marijuana is Schedule I. So there are really not a lot of studies out there going on about it, in this country at least. I mean, people who are proponents of cannabis will tell you, hey, look at other places, look at Israel, go to Europe, check out check out the studies there and stuff. But at least to convince a United States senator or someone like that, I think they're going to want to see something that's done under the purview of the FDA. They're going to want to see studies that are done right by people, which is, good luck on that happening. Right. And they're going to want to see studies here out of various universities that are well respected in the United States. And I just don't think that you're going to get them to read something that's happening. And
there seems to be a swelling of the anecdotal, where more and more people are having success with Rick Simpson oil, and more people are getting off of fentanyl with cannabis. And it's almost coming to a head of where you can't ignore the anecdotal anymore. What do you think we can do as cannabis advocates to help increase our leadership's knowledge of what we say we are seeing happening in our lives? Mm-hmm. Like, it's not so much, I don't know, sometimes I feel like maybe they think we just want to party, and we're like, hey, this saved my aunt's life.
Right. Yeah. No, I know. It's an unfortunate stigma that runs parallel with the use of cannabis products.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really frustrating for me, is because I know it's a stigma that was falsely created because of an agenda, a political agenda.
Right.
And that's given them the power to delay it even more and more and more.
Right, absolutely. And that has done nothing but carry its weight through the 90s and through the 2000s until we're now finally, I think that we are. I think you're right to call it a swelling, and it's coming to a head. And I think the fact that, we see that, I think the majority of medical cannabis users in this country are 40 plus. In Ohio, over a quarter of the patients so far are 50 plus, which was a stat that sort of blew me away, because I think when you start getting those folks on board, and they're the ones who start to say, hey, this stuff's actually helping me. I'm not a delinquent stoner. Right. I'm a baby boomer. I've lived a great life, and now I'm sort of starting to see that, hey, some of this stuff can help me with some of my ailments. I think that getting those folks on board will be a huge swing to keep the momentum going, and also one that I would have never predicted. Mm-hmm. So I thought that people, maybe in their 30s would be the ones now who are really sort of carrying the torch and just saying, this stuff that can help with a lot of things. So I'm pretty surprised by that. So, but it's a really good question. You have the $1 million question. What do you do as a patient or an advocate? How do you get, I don't know what percent of the population has been down with writing their representatives about this stuff. Yeah. Who does that? But other than that, I really don't know. Probably becoming part of patient advocacy groups and just continue to tell the anecdotes.
Yeah, I think marches have a good public...
Good optics.
Good optics, yeah. Yes. Marches have great optics.
Yep.
But cannabis community does not seem to be organized enough to say, hey, we're all going to take our vacation at the same time and we're going to meet up in D.C. and protest. It's like...
the powers that be are saying, well, it's just because they're dumb stoners. They can't organize.
Exactly.
And you're just like, well, no, that's not That's not
it
it
couldn't
at
be
all.
the fact
It's
that
just,
the people who are actually having their lives saved by it are laid up and can't actually march.
That's right. That's right. It's probably very
But we
true.
do need people who do have the legs to march to stand up for those people and say, hey, I don't know. I'm getting ahead of myself, I guess. I don't know.
You want to go to D.C. right now?
I do, but no one would come with me.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Like, oh, Curtis is getting on that flight. All the power to him. Yeah. I think
We'll be cheering for you on Facebook.
Right, yeah. I think that, I don't know. I don't even know who the most pro legislator is out there, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't know who that is. You'd probably want to start with them.
What about the local decriminalization efforts? Like you see Dayton saying, well, if you get caught, there's no fine, no time.
Yeah.
Do you think those are a good movement towards?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if it's a good move. It's obviously, again, it's just
Maybe
another.
not the most effective or direct, but
Yeah, but it's nice because you have people at the local government level saying, okay, you know what? We recognize we can probably do something about this. You know, somebody gets caught with a joint now. We're not going to throw them behind bars.
Right.
We're not going to, keep their stuff, like make them forfeit their civil assets or whatever. I mean, which is, I think, that's a really great step because, I mean, if you asked anybody on the street and said, hey, do you think that person who got caught with a joint should be in jail for, 30 days or something? They're just like, well, no, that's ridiculous. It's a nonviolent offense. And, there aren't a lot of anecdotes out there about how someone, maybe smokes a joint and goes and kills somebody. That just isn't something that a lot of people, I think, would be on board with saying actually occurs. So I think that the decriminalization efforts at the local level are definitely a good place to start. At least they show that what I believe to be true, at least with respect to how the majority of the population sort of views the use of cannabis. So it's definitely a move in the right direction. And, I don't know much about it, but the federal government recently passed, I think it was called the First Step legislation, but it was about reducing sentences for certain criminal offenses, which was a really big step. It's an actual law, and it reduced certain sentences for nonviolent offenders. It was something that was bipartisan, which was sort of like, wow. Democrats and Republicans are getting behind an effort to say that we have too many people in jail over stupid things. So,
yeah, I mean, you hear a lot of conspiracy theories, like the government is being paid by these corporations that own prisons to keep these laws this way. And then you hear the government doesn't want to change cannabis laws because of pharmaceutical lobbyists. How much truth do you think in reality lives there?
That is also a really good question, because I think you can probably imagine that someone in my position who is supposed to always be a zealous advocate for their client, I don't always know where the information is coming from, and I have heard a lot of these, quote, conspiracy theories. Now, I will also say that just being an American citizen in a capitalist society, that money often does sort of rule. So I think there is definitely some truth in the follow the money. So there could be some efforts by pharmaceutical companies or otherwise out there to, influence legislation against marijuana. There's probably some truth to that. To what extent, how great of an effort that is, or whether it's just a lack of understanding, or whether these companies also, maybe they do have some really good data out there that does say that it's bad for you. I mean, I haven't seen that, but at the same time, I don't know. It's interesting because I do talk about that with my colleagues a lot, because they come to me and they'll say, hey, well, what do you actually think about this stuff? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't read scientific studies. I help businesses and I help healthcare providers try to do whatever they want with respect to a law and comply with that law as best as possible. So it's more or less that I try to figure out, what is the best way to advocate for my client while doing that without sort of championing their efforts with respect to whatever beliefs they have, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's a difficult, especially with something like medical cannabis. Who knows? I mean, maybe the people who have said that pharmaceutical companies have been lobbying legislators for years to keep marijuana laws the way they are, maybe that's right. Maybe it's not.
I really don't know.
I really don't know.
Yeah, I think that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, as it usually does, where, there probably are pharmaceutical lobbyists paying a lot of money to try to keep them as the forefront for medical treatments. But eventually, I do believe the anecdotal stories will swell to a point where they'll be like, yeah, but my constituents say that I'm making them die because of this money. So no.
You're right. No, absolutely. And also, so if there are people out there who say that pharmaceutical companies, billion dollar industry, have been lobbying legislators, well, the marijuana industry is also getting to be a billion dollar industry. So eventually, if it's about lining the pockets of somebody who represents you, eventually the marijuana industry is going to have the same exact clout, the same exact power. They're going to do the same thing. So maybe at that point we'll finally have a legislator listen to its constituents as opposed to maybe who's, funding their next black tie gala.
There's patients out there who are scared. They got their card that they're seeing on the news that people are being arrested, getting pulled over and being arrested. What advice could you give to that person to feel like they could go to the dispensary and come home and be above reproach?
Right. No, absolutely. Well, I think that they should not be scared by the news or anything like that. At least in Ohio, any registered patient or registered caregiver is completely protected from state prosecution, arrest or detention or anything like that, because they might have medical cannabis on them, for example. And also that the Rohrabacher Amendment that I mentioned earlier completely protects them from any federal prosecution. So they should feel completely comfortable. They have to understand, too, that, this was the will of the actual state legislature. So it wasn't by vote by the people, which also, have the same weight. But at the same time, these were the people who represent the people around the state of Ohio came together and said, hey, we want to pass a medical marijuana law. So they should understand that and feel comfortable with the fact that this is legal as passed by their representatives in this state.
Yeah, I think that's great. The only other thing I would add to that is to just transport it the way the state regulates you transporting it. And if you do that, then absolutely, I don't think you'll have any problems.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the stories you're hearing are people who are, I don't know, probably actually doing something that they shouldn't be doing according to the written out.
Right. Yeah.
Law.
Something nefarious. Well, yeah. No, that's a great point. And what we saw actually a few weeks ago was, and I was waiting for this to happen. The state says it did not come up with this plan or anything like that, but the feeling on the side of the patients is that they did. There were patients who were going up to Michigan, crossing state lines and buying from a dispensary in Michigan and then driving back into Ohio. And even if you are a registered patient in Ohio, as of right now, that is not allowed under Ohio law. And a lot of those patients had their dispensary products confiscated, and they also had to pay fines. So, as of right now, the state of Ohio does not have any reciprocity with other medical cannabis states, but they have written in the law that they have to make a good faith effort to negotiate with those other states. So,
is there a timeline on that?
There's no timeline, but a good faith effort, if nothing starts to happen or they're not engaging in actual talks, then, there would be, someone could,
call them on it.
Right, make some sort of claim against that. But we have seen the Board of Pharmacy has said that, hey, we are trying to negotiate with Michigan, for example, and one of the difficulties they're running into right now is the sharing of patient data, obviously privacy concerns and stuff like that. So they're working through some of those issues. But, other states have reciprocity agreements with one another. So I would just imagine that that's on the horizon too. But yeah, if you live in the northwest of Ohio, for example, you obviously are probably pretty persuaded by the fact that an ounce in Michigan is going to cost you $160 less than it is in Ohio. And especially if you don't have a dispensary that's open up down the street from you yet.
If someone did find themselves in trouble as a medical cannabis patient over cannabis, should they seek out just a regular criminal attorney, or there should be a different kind of attorney that they should be seeking out?
You want someone who knows the law. And definitely, if there's a criminal attorney who they would generally go to for any type of drug violation, as long as that person has experience with Ohio's medical marijuana law, I would say, sure, go to them. But the odds of these people actually getting into trouble, unless they're doing something nefarious, are really, the odds are so small.
So if you got in trouble and in the back of your mind, you didn't do something 100% right, maybe just get that criminal defense attorney?
Yeah. I mean, because they're going to be able to figure it out. I mean, it's right there in the Ohio Revised Code that, the state can't do anything to you if you're a registered patient and you're doing everything right.
What about workplace drug testing? What can people do to help turn that stigma around to where employers see that this is something that people can use and still be functioning, productive human beings?
Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer to that.
That's
one.
fair.
Yeah.
These are just questions I've been thinking about.
Sure. I mean, well, you know what? I will say that the fact that the unemployment rate right now in this country is so low, it's at like 4%. So big employers are starting to reevaluate their stance on something like cannabis because they're like, hey, if we want to retain good workers, and eventually there's estimates that Ohio is going to have 200,000 patients in its program. I mean, that's 200,000 people who, one of those people might be a super high producing worker at X company. And it was the company going to say, hey, Sean, sorry, you tested positive on our annual drug screen, even though you're epileptic. Sorry, we got to let you go. I mean, are they really going to, they want to let Sean go if he's their best sales guy or something like that? I mean, they're really taking a hard look and starting to realize that, hey, some people who do take this can still be high functioning employees. So the risk is also on them to let them go. But like, as you said, the law allows you to take an adverse employment action against an employee if you want to in Ohio, and they're well within their rights to do that. But if it's at the risk of losing someone who's high producing or good around the office, I mean, at what cost?
So you're saying be really good at your job?
Yeah. Keep being super, super productive at your job, and hopefully your employer will not let you go.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I mean, eventually your portfolio will look so good that they won't want to let you go, right. I would think. I mean,
they're going to say we're going to stop doing those quarterly drug tests.
We are almost out of time, but I do want to ask you one more question, actually two.
Sure.
But this first one is about families who have people that they love who are in nursing homes, mm-hmm. who have qualifying conditions. What legal advice could you give them in experimenting with treatment, implementing treatment, going after a recommendation, all that kind of stuff to keep them and their family members above reproach in the eyes of the law as well as the nursing home? Sure.
So it sort of depends on whether or not a patient is in a sort of a long-term care facility setting where they're going to be there and they don't leave because, maybe they can't drive or something, but they do have a qualifying medical condition. Obviously, it's going to be up to that facility that they're at, whether or not they're able to even have the cannabis. And if they are allowed to, then what at least maybe a family member is going to want to do is, if that individual who's in that care decides they want to seek medical cannabis treatment, have the family member serve as their designated caregiver. So then they're able to go to a dispensary on their behalf. And again, like we said earlier, they're protected from any criminal arrest or any state law violations just for serving as a caregiver. You're not going to be arrested or anything like that. You can't be, you just can't have anything adverse taken against you at the state level. You can then drive to the dispensary and bring it back in, and you can actually administer if necessary, you can administer the cannabis treatments to your loved one in the nursing facility, as long as they allow it.
So first, get permission from the facility to make sure that it's okay.
Right.
Then go through the legal steps to be right with the state.
Mm-hmm.
Then purchase your product at a legal dispensary.
Yes.
And then administer it to the patient before, that will be the actual experiment, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it's, so if you can convince a loved one who's in their 70s and they do suffer from some sort of condition that qualifies them, if they actually do go to a physician, I think likely, at least what I've seen, a lot of the physicians who are involved with this type of care have really good reputations, and they're, under the law, they have to develop a treatment plan for you. So it's not just like maybe what people would think. I think of an Entourage episode where Drama and Turtle were going to the medical marijuana dispensary and they were just popping in, getting a card, and then walking out. I mean, Ohio physicians have to actually develop a treatment plan for you, and they'll have to say, Dolores, for example, we're going to try this for you. We want you to come back at X day. We want you to administer at this because we think it works for this condition. So it's not just like a pop in and pop out. They're actually by law charged with developing how your treatment's going to go with this. So you want to educate the loved one as well. Like, hey, if you've ever been interested in this, we should try it out. And it's not just sort of some one-off thing that's going to happen once and, no one's going to monitor your care. These physicians are actually charged with monitoring your care. So understanding that you're going to have someone from a scientific or clinical perspective keeping an eye on you is probably something you want to tell the patient as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think that's, I see videos on YouTube or whatever of people giving their elderly relative cannabis, and it's a great experience. And I just want to make sure people understand that in Ohio, you can't just go to your grandparents' nursing home, give them a brownie, and be okay. Like,
right.
There's actually steps and procedures to do it right so that you will not be possibly facing consequences.
Right, yeah, and consequences even, for the loved one who's in the nursing home. I mean, we don't want them to get kicked out.
Right.
I mean, that's the
they need that bed.
Right, exactly. So yeah, you don't want to get cross with whatever the facility is.
Yeah.
But again, since the majority, not the majority, at least a quarter of the patients who are 50 plus are the ones who are actually getting recommendations. I think we're going to see a lot of the senior living facilities, a lot of the nursing homes are going to start coming around to this idea that, hey, these people are going to be coming in here with this stuff. So we need to develop a plan as maybe opposed to just saying, we're prohibiting you from coming in here. Especially because those places charge a lot of money to have people stay there. So they're going to have to try to get on board with the idea of how they're going to develop a program that allows patients, to actually come in and take the treatments. There was a woman in Florida who was denied usage. She had Crohn's disease and Parkinson's, and the nursing facility there, they just wouldn't allow her to have it because of the federal law risk that we talked about earlier. And it was just sort of all over the news. It blew up, bad optics for them, and it just essentially looked like, someone didn't want to allow someone who had a qualifying condition under Florida's law to have this stuff. It was just sort of a bad look for them.
Yeah.
And, who knows? There are crafty plaintiffs' attorneys out there. They could probably come up with some sort of patient's rights violation. I'm not saying that would ever be successful, but that's just something for those facilities to consider as well.
That's all I had for today. Is there anything that you wanted to cover or anything you want to say to people considering cannabis today?
I think that it's important to just, know your rights and know that you're protected. There are a lot of protections out there. I think, again, that the horse has left the barn on medical cannabis. So if it's something you're interested in, to try and seek out the physician that you're comfortable with and just making sure that you're doing things in line with the law, and I think you'll be fine.
All right, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Curtis.
If you would like to be a guest and share how cannabis has helped your health and wellness, contact us at considercannabisnow.com. If you found anything of value in this episode, please share it with someone else. Remember to subscribe for free and get every new episode delivered right to your phone. Join us next time as we consider cannabis together.